starring Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brebeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are doing a novel, Death on the Nile.
Woohoo! This is a big one. Let's just jump right in. Very quickly, publication on this one, November 1st, 1937 in the UK. That's the first publication date.
We are basically at the place in history that Italy signs on with Germany and Japan. They signed on 2 days after the book was published.
We are hurtling into World War II, and we will get there within the Christieverse as well, right?
Right, absolutely.
And we will be discussing that a lot more in future novels. But for now, let's focus on this novel and talk about our victim, Mrs. Lynette Doyle, née Ridgway. When we first meet her, her name is still Lynette Ridgway. And she is a wealthy young woman, an heiress who has it all. She really just has it all.
I can do it! I can have it all!
And a lot of people seem to dislike her for that, but then also to dislike her for some rather valid reasons. But she's beautiful, she's smart, she's rich. She's shot dead in her cabin aboard the SS Karnak on the River Nile with a rather small, somewhat scorched bullet hole in her head. We will have other victims. We will get to them as we talk about what happens in this story. So let's turn to our cast of suspects, which is quite large. I was struck in rereading Death on the Nile, the parallels just in my mind that I kept on making between it and Murder on the Orient Express, and of how in many ways those parallels were not actually warranted. And I realized that the only reason I was making those parallels was that the two classic splashy 70s movies that all Christie lovers watched, either when they first were released or at some point in their childhoods or young adulthoods, are those two movies. But as books, there's a significant difference between them. They both do feature large casts of characters, but in Murder on the Orient Express, obviously, everyone was significant. And in this one, they just don't matter as much. So let's just roll right through them here. First up is Mr. Simon Doyle, who is Lynette's new husband, formerly penniless, now the husband of a millionaire.
And then, perhaps more importantly, we have Jacqueline de Belfort, Lynette's best friend, and she was engaged. She was enfianced to Mr. Simon Doyle.
That made the BFF an ex-BFF for sure.
For sure. And also, she is a stalker.
Her mode of revenge is to stalk this newlywed couple and make their lives a living hell. That is what she has decided to do. Yeah. And this love triangle is central to the book in more ways than one. Those three characters by far are the most important characters. Then we have Salome Otterborn, who is the third novelist to be lampooned mercilessly by Agatha Christie in a novel.
Also, my God, her name is Salome Otterborn.
Her name is Salome Otterborn, but I will say this. John Curran in the Agatha Christie notebooks has two really fun facts to come out of an early list of characters that Christie made for Death on the Nile. The first one is that Salome Otterborn's original name was, wait for it, Mrs. Pooper.
Oh.
So Salome Otterborn isn't necessarily such a bad name after all. The other really interesting thing, do you know which detective was within that cast of characters that Agatha Christie made? Miss Marple.
Miss Marple.
She contemplated this being a Miss Marple novel, which is so bizarre because up till now, all we had of Miss Marple was Murder at the Vicarage and the 13 Problem Stories, all of which have Miss Marple firmly ensconced in St. Mary Mead and seemingly
not ever traveling.
Yeah, she does eventually travel, of course, to the Caribbean, but not for many, many decades. Hercule Poirot, as we already covered, did even go to Egypt in The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb in the 20s and has already globe-trotted quite a bit in novel form, so I think he was a more natural fit. But it's really interesting to imagine Death on the Nile being a Miss Marple novel. Let's move on to the daughter of Salome Otterborn, Rosalie, who is pretty but just grumpy. She's always got a scowl on her face and she seems very guarded, and there's something up with Rosalie.
So then we have Mr. Ferguson, who's a communist.
And we've totally called out this stock character in Christie now. He is 100% the young, angry communist who she treats patronizingly as not necessarily a bad kind of guy, but he doesn't really know what he's talking about, and he's sort of an idiot, and he talks talks a good game, but, all words, no action. It says a lot about Christie's politics, I think. She just doesn't ultimately have a lot of respect for that sort of posturing from that sort of man.
And then we have Louise Bourget, who is Lynette Doyle's current maid.
Next is Fleetwood, one of the engineers on the boat who was all set to marry Lynette's former maid, Marie, except that Lynette found out he was already married to an Egyptian woman, and when Lynette told Marie, the maid called it off, giving Fleetwood one of the more straightforward motives for killing Lynette. Spoiler, he had absolutely nothing to do with it.
And then we have Dr. Bessner. He's a German stereotype. I mean, unless most Germans just go around saying, oh, a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of Teutonic exclamations.
Correct. And he's also a medical doctor, as his name would imply, and that becomes rather useful since there are a lot of bodies that we're dealing with here. And then we have Signor Ricchetti. He's Italian. He's suspicious for a bunch of reasons, namely that he's foreign.
Which is also a parallel between this novel and Murder on the Orient Express. There is also much made of the warm-bloodedness of Italians in that novel.
Yep.
Next, we have Jim Fanthorpe, who is a lawyer who seems to have some sort of a secret agenda aboard this Nile steamer.
And then we have Tim and Mrs. Allerton.
Tim and Mrs. Allerton absolutely come as a pair, and I do mean all of the sort of Oedipal discomfort that may go along with that statement. And that is in the book. It is very much in one of the adaptations we will discuss.
Yep. On top of them, we have Marie Van Schuyler.
Angelica, Peggy, Eliza.
She's probably a direct descendant of Peggy.
Yeah, she's a Peggy.
Yeah, Peggy is like her great-great-grandmother.
Yeah.
Not even, actually. Peggy's probably like her grandmother.
She's a definite Peggy.
She's basically just a pain, and she has two people in her employ.
Well, and also she's a kleptomaniac.
And also she's a kleptomaniac. There's a lot of side plotting on that score, but she has two people in her employ. One is a poor relation, her cousin Cornelia Robson, who has a sunny, forgiving disposition that many aboard appreciate, but certainly not Cousin Marie. And then we also have Miss Van Schuyler's nurse, Miss Bowers, who does her job efficiently, as many a nurse seems to do in an Agatha Christie novel. And let's not forget that she herself worked as a nurse. So I think she had a lot of respect for the profession.
And then, last but certainly not least, we have Andrew Pennington, financial advisor overseeing her estate.
When Lynette turns 21, all of her estate will be entirely vested in her, and she'll no longer need to have anything to do with Andrew Pennington and his business partner. But Lynette is only 20, so the trigger is either turning 21 or getting married. Let's talk about the world as it appears to be. Jackie went to Lynette and asked her to do her a favor, which was giving her fiancé a job, and Lynette gave him a job and then gave him another job when she married him. The book opens, the first chapter of this novel, I found to be a little awkward and disjointed because it's separated into 12 parts. There are 12 parts denoted by Roman numerals, and it's quite long, in which all of the characters are introduced. It's just a lot. It's a lot to take in, but one of the more, I think, successful introductions is Poirot in a fancy restaurant dining alone and overhearing a conversation between Jackie and Simon when they're still engaged, and noting how intense Jackie is and how she seems to love too much. And one of the things I actually do enjoy in this novel is the relationship between Poirot and Jackie, because they have this deeper understanding between the two of them, and their conversations are very confidential and piercing in a way that is unusual in a Poirot novel, and that is sustained from beginning to end, and he just seems to get her. So that is the setup. As we said, there's a major love triangle going on here. That is the setup at the start of the novel, and Jackie is the odd man out. Unfortunately for this newlywed couple, they decide to have their honeymoon in Egypt, and Jackie follows them, and she's followed them through Europe. She follows them into Egypt, and Simon and Lynette think that they've been clever.
Super stalker.
She's total stalker. Simon and Lynette think they've been clever and have booked a passage on this steamer down the Nile, the SS Karnak, as has Poirot and all of our other characters that we've mentioned.
And Colonel Race.
And Colonel Colonel Race appears, although very true to Colonel Race, he appears in the middle of the book very randomly.
Over halfway through the book, I think.
Halfway through the book, which is very different from the appearance of Colonel Race, certainly in the classic movie that most people know, where he's played by David Niven quite delightfully. And even in the Suchet adaptation, he appears very randomly. And we had just seen him leave a book in the middle of the book randomly in Cards on the Table. So this is totally what Colonel Race does. I guess I appreciate the consistency there, but I don't think there's a lot of there with Colonel Race as a character.
No, he's like a weird creeper in every book that he shows up in.
Yeah, he's a total cipher. I mean, our best portrayal of him was, of course, in The Man in the Brown Suit. When he fell in love with Anne Bedingfeld. But since then, he's just a bit of a cipher in these books, and that is certainly the case here. But everyone is on this boat, including, unfortunately, for Simon and Lynette, Jackie. She managed to, it seems, figure out that they were going aboard the steamer, and she is there as well. And a lot of things then proceed to happen on this journey on the Nile.
Lynette gets almost crushed to death at a historic site, but she doesn't die. So she
survives.
At this point, we are probably, a third of the way through the book, and we have no death.
Oh, yeah. Lynette is our victim, and I think this is the first novel, and I'm not sure if there are others. I noted when it happened, it was just shy of the halfway mark when Lynette died. We are almost 150 pages into this book with no murder victim.
Correct.
Which is pretty unusual.
There's not even a crime.
No, there's not even a crime that happens. But this is why, unusually for me, I actually like the first half of this mystery puzzle more than the second half, because I actually think that Christie does handle the interplay of this love triangle really well. And for me, the high point of the book is actually these two chapters. I believe it's the fourth and fifth chapter, in which Lynette approaches Poirot and essentially asks him to handle Jackie and say, can you just get her to lay off of me and leave us alone because I can't handle it. And this is yet another parallel to Murder on the Orient Express. This is a much better version of the scene in Murder on the Orient Express when Cassetti goes up to Poirot and says, will you take my case? And he says, I don't like your face. Get out of mine, essentially. Here, Lynette is a lady. He doesn't say that, but he basically says, I don't like who you are. I don't like what you've done. You have two different ways that you could be reacting to what Jackie is doing to you right now. You could have pity for her, but you don't. What you feel is outraged. And the reason why you feel outraged is because you feel guilty, because essentially you are not a very good person who took the one thing of value that Jackie had when you had so much. And he's quoting biblical stories to her, and she's very upset. And it's a really great scene for Poirot. And then right after that, he actually does go to Jackie, and she's like, oh, Lynette sent you. I don't want to talk to you. And he's like, no, I'm not here as her emissary. But what I'd like to say to you is, please stop. Please don't open your heart up to evil, because once you do, you're not going to be able to stop it from taking over you. And this is the beginning of their heart-to-heart relationship that is sustained throughout the novel. What I love about these scenes is that they illuminate the love triangle among these three characters, but they actually also illuminate a lot about Poirot.
Poirot is this intense romantic.
Yeah.
And that is something that, before we started doing this in depth, I sort of had some sense of it, I guess, from the Suchet adaptations, but I didn't really think that it was there in the text, except it is.
He is romantic, but that's why, and it happens in this chapter with Jackie. This is probably the most devastating line in the entire book, and it's all about Poirot. And as I mentioned, it's totally brought out in the Suchet version, because she's railing on about love and how she loves Simon and she's never going to stop loving him. And this is what he says. Love is not everything, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. It is only when we are young that we think it is. And it is quietly depressing and powerful within this scene, and it really is a window onto Poirot's history, I think, in his soul. And it is very obvious that he loved once as Jackie loved, with intensity. And obviously, based on his personal circumstances, he's not married, he doesn't have children. It didn't work out, and he's broken. For an author who never gets credit for nuanced characterization, I think it's an incredible moment. Because in the Suchet version, it's still a delicately handled scene due to Suchet's amazing acting, but Poirot's personal pain is made a little more obvious, and Suchet himself talks about this writing in his book Poirot and Me. Death on the Nile also gave me an opportunity to deepen my portrait of Poirot and underline his particular sense of vulnerability and loneliness. And we don't normally clip from the adaptations at this point in our episodes, but here's how that scene plays out in the Suchet adaptation. I think it's really interesting putting it side by side with the excerpt from the book.
Love is not everything.
Oh, but it is. It is. You must know that, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you understand.
It is terrible, mademoiselle. All that I have missed in life.
Of course, none of this has anything to do with the mystery puzzle we've yet to get into.
I mean, my argument about it would be that it's not a very good puzzle. It's convoluted in a number of ways, and then the things about it that are good are emotional.
Christie herself even realized that. She said that those three characters, Simon, Jackie, and Lynette, feel real, they feel robust, and there's a lot going on there in a way that she often didn't achieve with her characters, to be perfectly honest, but she 100% does. And I would even argue, and then in Poirot's interactions with all three of them, there's a lot to mine there, and it has nothing to do with the mystery.
Let's get back to the mystery. So we're a bit further into our steamer voyage aboard the Karnak here on the Nile, and it's after dinner in the observation saloon, which sounds like a very glamorous place to be, you know? And so Miss Van Schuyler's sister is missing her stole and being a little touchy about it. Poirot is kind of sleepy, and Lynette and Simon Doyle are playing bridge with Colonel Race and Andrew Pennington, which, gee, Colonel Race, champion bridge player.
I wonder who was dummy. Little cards on the table humor for you.
I know. Hey, we could go back to the intricacies of bridge that we don't understand.
So Poirot and the others filter out, all except Jim Fanthorpe, Cornelia Robson, and the bridge players. Enter Jacqueline, who drinks a bunch of alcohol and does everything she can to disrupt the Doyle's bridge game. Lynette is basically like, I'm outie, I can't handle this, followed by Race and Pennington. Cornelia is about to leave too, but Jacqueline begs her to stay. Simon essentially tells her she's drunk and needs to sleep it off, at which point she warns him stuff is about to get fairly real, and Jim Fanthorpe plays the reserved Brit and is like, this is uncomfortable, I'm going to leave now. And not a moment too soon, apparently, because Jackie produces that little gun she already showed Poirot and fires it off in Simon's direction.
So Simon falls across a chair, at which point Cornelia rushes out of the saloon to grab Mr. Fanthorpe, who's conveniently still just outside. And they come back and they see Simon lying across the chair. There is a crimson stain, which is always a great thing, on a handkerchief he's holding. And Jackie drops the pistol, kicks it away with her foot under a settee, and now she's very hysterical and apologetic, to her credit, I suppose.
Simon asks Fanthorpe to take Jackie to her room, and then he asks Cornelia to get Miss Bowers to look after Jackie for the night. And then only after they're sure Jackie is okay should they go get Dr. Bessner and bring him to the saloon to tend to Simon. Cornelia and Fanthorpe do as they're told. When Bessner arrives in the saloon a number of minutes later, he confirms, yes, Simon's leg is fractured. It's really bad. There's no way he can walk on it. So they carry Simon to Dr. Bessner's cabin, where he will remain for the duration of the Karnak's voyage. But before giving into the sweet, sweet power of a sedative, Simon tells Fanthorpe to go get that gun from the floor in the saloon. Fanthorpe goes, but dun dun dun, the gun is gone.
Oh dear. Well, okay. So the next morning, and yes, we are halfway through the novel. That's a thing.
Still don't have a dead body.
No, Colonel Race informs Poirot that Lynette Doyle has been found dead.
Woohoo, there's her dead body.
There we have it. Shot in her bed, just above the ear. The bullet made scorch marks upon entry, which, I mean, I guess we can assume that she was shot at close range from that. There's a J written in her blood on the wall next to her, and the bullet seems to... Super cool. And the bullet seems to match whatever the caliber was in Jackie's gun that is missing.
Interesting. So that's where we are before we get to our clues. But first, I think we need to clear away a few of the many many side plots Christie throws into this story to obfuscate the mystery puzzle. And it's funny because in her autobiography, she actually said that upon rereading Murder at the Vicarage, she felt it had, quote, far too many characters and too many subplots, end quote. And I have to wonder whether she felt the same way about this novel, because that's what I would say about Death on the Nile, quite honestly. My problem, and I think you would agree with this, Catherine, is that the side plots have so little to do with the main concern of the novel, which is, of course, not only the murder of Lynette Doyle, but to a larger degree, that love triangle among Simon, Jackie, and Lynette. And the best side plot, in my opinion, is the only side plot that is tethered to Lynette, is her trustee, Andrew Pennington, in that he apparently, due to the little thing known as the Great Depression, seems to have sunk poor Lynette's funds into some bad investments, and he doesn't want to own up to it. So he would benefit from her death in that everything would then go to Simon Doyle, who has identified himself as essentially a nincompoop who will sign anything and doesn't really read the fine print. So,
right. So Andrew
Pennington actually has a motive to kill Lynette so that her husband will inherit her fortune.
Or her not fortune.
Or her not fortune, exactly. That is why Andrew Pennington is the one who tried to crush Lynette with a boulder. Tell us about our next side plot, Catherine.
Who is Colonel Race looking for?
The Colonel Race side plot, he's looking for this agitator who has apparently committed murder before, and he knows that they are on the boat. And you know what? It turns out to be Brichetti, the Italian. And that's it. And he has nothing to do with the murder, and that's all there is to say about that side plot. It has nothing to do with anything, and it's a fairly cheap and obvious means of obfuscation. There are a couple more, but I think the only other one worth mentioning, because it's so insane, is this jewel thievery ring.
Right.
Lynette Doyle has this set of pearls that she always wears, and that goes missing as well in the aftermath of her death. And it turns out that kleptomaniac Miss Van Skyler thought that she stole her pearls, but what she actually ended up stealing was a fake set of pearls, because the real pearls were stolen by Tim Allerton, who's essentially an amateur jewel thief working with his cousin, who we meet early on in the book, and her name's Joanna Southwood. She's not even on this Nile steamer, so we know she has nothing to do with Lynette's murder, but she and Tim work together, and we won't go into the mechanics of how it works because it's not very interesting. It has nothing to do with anything, but they've been working together to affect several jewel heists, essentially.
For quite some length about how that is executed.
Oh, yeah, and it involves the fact that the pearls were actually taken off of their string and secreted in a rosary bead in Tim Allerton's room. Okay, sure. Fantastic. Actually, I will mention one other side plot, and that is the fact that Mr. Ferguson, the supposed communist, is actually Lord Dawlish. He's a member of the aristocracy who went commie when he went to Oxford, as happens to so many college students these days and any day. And he has designs on Cornelia Robson. He decides that she's an amazing woman because she's just such a good person and so original in her sunny thoughts. And he proposes marriage to her, and she ends up turning him down for Dr. Bessner, the kind of frumpy German doctor. And this romantic intrigue takes up a lot of space, as does the related romantic intrigue between Tim Allerton and Rosalie Otterborn, who end up together at the end of the novel anyway. So I don't think there's a lot of sophistication to most of these side plots, and all they really do is create a lot of confusion that keeps us from being able to solve the mystery too soon. And Poirot himself even makes a reference to murder in Mesopotamia before explaining how the murder was committed. He actually says, what I'm doing is clearing away all the dirt and the detritus the way that one does at an archaeological dig, as I learned in Mesopotamia recently. So having done that, let's turn to our real clues, which will take us through the many twists and turns of this rather convoluted puzzle mystery. Clue number one, Catherine.
Clue numero uno. Poirot is sitting at a table in the dining room with Mrs. Allerton, who drinks mineral water, and Tim Allerton, who drinks whiskey and soda. Poirot drinks wine, bien sûr. The deduction here is that it would be very easy to slip a sedative into Poirot's wine bottle since he's the only one drinking wine, which apparently has just been sitting all day on their dining table. That would make him groggy, which obviously he is on the night of the murder. And this is a fair point, I think. It's very clear in the text that Poirot is unusually sleepy.
Yeah, she makes a lot of it. It's not like this is mentioned once and never again. It's in there a couple of times.
The point and the deduction that we should clearly make from this is that the murder is premeditated.
Right. And yeah, I mean, it's significant because on its face, this looks like someone just happened to see Jackie drop her gun and then grabbed it and shot Lynette, but it can't be the case if Poirot's wine was drugged. Okay, so clue number 2. The murderer smeared the letter J at the scene of the crime in Lynette's blood and yet bothered to take away Jackie's gun. So the deduction here is that we know Lynette couldn't have done this herself since she died instantly. But if the murderer then was so interested in implicating Jackie, or at least in making it seem like Jackie was implicated, why not leave Jackie's gun there too? Again, the bullet, it was almost definitely, a bullet from her gun. Everyone knew Jackie's gun. She had dropped it minutes before. It would be much simpler to implicate Jackie by leaving her gun there than this J business in blood. So the deduction there, which is a little difficult but also important, is that it has to be because the gun still had a role to play after Lynette was shot. Right. And Poirot also does harp on that point a lot. He says, why wasn't the gun left at the scene of the crime?
Clue number 3. At this point, the gun is dredged out of the Nile, which is, to be honest, kind of remarkable given that it's the Nile.
Well, the boat's kind of moored, though, right? I think it's moored in one spot at this point.
Still, though, I
agreed.
But it's wrapped up in Miss Van Schuyler's stole, along with a pink-stained handkerchief. And there are 2 bullets missing from it, and the stole has holes in it that seem to have been made by a gunshot. Curious. So, what is our deduction here? Well, neither the gunshot made by Jackie nor the gunshot to Lynette's head could really have involved the velvet stole. We saw Jackie's gunshot in the saloon, obviously, and there were burn marks on Lynette's head, so we know the gun was placed, if not directly on her skin, then at basically point-blank range.
Right, there certainly wasn't a stole around Lynette's face when she was shot.
No, so then there must have been a third gunshot, one that the shooter was not only desperate to muffle the sound of, but also the existence of, since, again, when the gun is retrieved, it only has the 2 bullets missing, when there had to have been more than 2 gunshots.
To me, this is the best clue, and in some ways the most Christie-like clue in the whole novel, because it's one of those deductions that, having just explained it, it seems so obvious. Of course, there has to be a third gunshot. It's not that obvious. It's very hard to get there. And then what's even worse, or better, depending on how you look at it, is that even after you're on the other side of this clue and you know that there's a third gunshot, there's still so much more that you have to get through before getting to the solution. This is what makes this such a convoluted puzzle mystery. There are just so many twists and turns here. This is a major clue, and yet we still have miles to go. So clue number 4, Poirot finds a bottle of nail polish on Lynette's washstand that has none of the pink nail polish it should have in it. Instead, it contains a few drops of a dark red liquid that smells nothing like nail polish. So the deduction there is that someone needed a red liquid for some reason, right? And given that the bottle was left in Lynette's cabin, it's a safe bet. Probably never actually safe to bet when you're working your way through a Christie mystery puzzle, but still, it is a reasonable assumption for an astute reader that the murderer probably put it there, because that's the only place that it could have been deposited without catching anyone's attention. For example, if it had been put in that package dropped in the Nile, then there would have been a lot of attention focused on that bottle, but a bottle of nail polish sitting next to another bottle of nail polish on Lynette's washstand is going to escape most people's notice. Of course, not Poirot's, but most people's. So what was the purpose of that red liquid? Come to think of it, having just mentioned the velvet stole package, could that pink-stained handkerchief have anything to do with this bottle of red liquid? Is it possible that the handkerchief was stained with this red liquid before being submerged in the Nile and getting washed out, thereby turning it pink?
Intriguing. All right, clue number 5, and this one's tricky. But there are a few minutes that pass between when Jackie shoots Simon and when Dr. Bassner then comes back to examine Simon. And the doctor, of course, confirms that the gunshot wound would have made Simon immobile, which is the crux of Simon's alibi.
Bear with us here, dear listeners, but let's think all the way back to a quiet little Miss Marple short story early in the 13 Problems collection, The Idle House of Astarte. In that one, a man seemed to be stabbed by magic, since no one was near him when he fell to the ground. Another man then approached the victim, confirming that he was indeed stabbed. But as it turned out, it was this moment of confirmation in which the victim was actually stabbed. Before that, he had just been pretending to be stabbed. We don't have quite the same situation here. Dr. Bassner obviously didn't shoot Simon while he was examining him. That's impossible.
That would be interesting. That would be an intriguing
interesting,
twist.
wouldn't it? But we do well to think back to that short story and wonder if Simon was indeed shot when he seemed to have been shot. Remember, let's try not to make even the most basic assumptions when working one's way through a Christie mystery puzzle.
Clue number 6. Louise is being interviewed by Poirot and Colonel Race in front of Simon Doyle and Dr. Bassner, and she makes this big show of hinting about, seeing Lynette's killer possibly either enter or leave her cabin, and then later she's killed with a piece of a franc note in her hand. So clearly we think that what she's trying to do is blackmail.
Louise is our second victim here.
Yes. And so the deduction is you would only hint about what you knew if you were talking to her within earshot of the murderer. Otherwise, you wouldn't just say anything, you bide your time. And so we know Poirot and Colonel Race didn't do it. So then we have Simon Doyle and Dr. Bassner. And we can kind of jump to the conclusion that it means that one of them had to have done it. Add to this that Louise could have sought out Dr. Bassner at any time, whereas Simon Doyle's laid up with his gunshot wound in Bassner's cabin, meaning he wasn't necessarily accessible. So we should be very suspicious, I think, of Simon Doyle.
Clue number 7. It's actually our first of 2 meta clues. An astute reader and an astute listener of this podcast, in particular, just might think back to 2 novels we've covered previously, The Mysterious Affair at Styles and The Murder at the Vicarage. And in both those novels, we started out with an obvious culprit. That was Alfred Inglethorpe in Styles and Lawrence Reading and Anne Prothero in Murder at the Vicarage. Those obvious culprits were subsequently cleared of suspicion, only to turn out to be the actual culprits in the end. This is, of course, Christie's beloved double bluff motif, and we actually have not seen the last of it. We will come across it in at least one future novel.
The double bluff is also in Lord Edward Dies.
Yeah, absolutely. And Christie herself, she writes about this. She loved it. She loved using the double bluff. To her, it was a classic trope to follow within detective novels and extremely satisfying, and she's right. Mm-hmm. She did it very well. So our deduction here is that we do have an obvious culprit, and that is Jackie. Everyone thinks it was Jackie. It was Jackie's gun. Jackie has the most obvious motive in that she really, really, really hates Lynette. But then Jackie is clear of suspicion because from the moment Lynette goes to bed till she's discovered dead in her bed, someone has always been with Jackie. But you know what? Let's just keep in mind that double bluff motif. Maybe, just maybe, Jackie did it after all. And if she did, the only way she would have been able to do it would be with an accomplice. Clue number 8, our final clue and second meta clue, as the scholar John Curran, who we've quoted many a time, notes in Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, Christie especially loves using that double bluff motif within the context of a secret romantic alliance. We, of course, had the romantic alliance of Lawrence Reading and Anne Prothero in Murder at the Vicarage, and that alliance actually wasn't all that secret for most of the novel. We found out about it pretty quickly. So the more instructive predecessor here is The Mysterious Affair at Styles, where Alfred Inglethorpe and his kissing cousin, never forget, Evelyn Howard, pretend to hate each other the entire book, only to turn out to have plotted poor Emily Inglethorpe's murder all along. So perhaps we have a somewhat similar situation here, or an exactly similar situation here. Perhaps at their core, as John Curran himself states, Death on the Nile and The Mysterious Affair of Styles are the exact same mystery puzzle, just in very different settings. The deduction here then is the solution to the mystery, which is that Jacqueline de Belfort and Simon Doyle don't hate each other. They never fell out of love, and they plan to murder Lynette Doyle for her money all along. Jackie merely pretended to shoot Simon, who used a handkerchief and a bunch of red ink stored in that pink nail polish bottle to make the shot look real. Then, in the few minutes between this first shot and when Dr. Bessner examined Simon, when Jackie was being hauled to bed and Simon was left alone, he was free to run to Lynette's cabin, dispose of the nail polish bottle, shoot her in the head, and make the J mark because he's kind of an idiot. That was his only contribution to the plan. Jackie was obviously the brains of the operation. Then Simon ran back, shot himself. That would be our third gunshot in the knee at point blank range, using the stole in the effort to muffle the sound and perhaps not make any scorch marks. Threw the gun and the ink-stained handkerchief in the Nile with the stole, and voila, we have the solution to our murder. All right, Catherine, we've gotten to our resolution here, but we still have some story to churn through before we get to the end of the novel, so let's have at it.
So Jackie has this perfect alibi minus the few minutes between the fake shot and the real shot. Simon also has a perfect alibi, except, Louise saw Simon either enter or leave, doesn't quite matter which one, Lynette's cabin. So when Simon and Jackie are left alone by Papa Poirot...
Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match.
Oh, he's such a yenta.
He's like, maybe these two crazy kids just might get back together again. I know, I'm gonna let Simon and Jackie talk to each other alone.
Oh,
Good one, Poirot.
Bad call. Instead, Simon tells Jackie about Louise blackmailing him. Jackie is the one who gives Louise the pile of francs and then stabs her in the heart while she's counting it.
But you know what? There's another oopsie, because Salome Otterborn, the famed novelist, saw Jackie go into Louise's cabin. And after Louise turns up dead, Salome manages, between swigs of secret moonshine, since she is secretly drinking, which would be the cause of her daughter's grumpiness, to put two and two together. And she bursts into Simon's cabin, where Monsieur Poirot and Colonel Race are, all eager to tell a story that, for once, people actually want to hear from her. And Simon starts shouting, thereby alerting Jackie to what's going on. Jackie runs into Andrew Pennington's room, where everyone knows he keeps a revolver, grabs it, and then shoots poor Salome from behind the curtain of the cabin door. And it's a good thing she was a good shot, or else I think Poirot could have lost some of his fabulous mustachios.
Of course, Poirot figures all of this out.
I would like to point out that within the novel, he does not do his grand denouement in front of the assembled cast of characters. The only people who are there are Colonel Race, Dr. Bessner, and Cornelia Robson. And we've said it before, but I would like to say it again, that whole motif of assembling everyone and giving this big dramatic performance is a much more consistent aspect of Christie adaptations than her original stories. Just putting that out there.
Of course. And, here he has no proof other than the little Grisels. But he goes for the weakest link first, which is obviously Simon, who is dumb. He confesses, and Jackie goes down with him. But
there's a final twist, Catherine, because as everyone's leaving the boat, Jackie whips out a second teeny tiny gun. Remember when there was that gun found in Rosalie Otterborn's purse that she seemed to know nothing about, and then she and Jackie were giggling together over lipsticks? Yeah, I didn't really remember that either, but that's the second gun, and Jackie shoots Simon with it and then herself. And while I may have forgotten about the gun, Poirot, it is made very clear in the text, did not forget about that second gun. He let this all happen because, as we all know by this point, Monsieur Poirot is all about the extra legal justice. Let's never forget Problem at Sea, the short story, where he induces a heart attack in a murderer so that the murderer will die. All right, so let's talk about the adaptations for Death on the Nile. Interestingly, the novel started its life as a play. Before it was a novel, it was a play called Moon on the Nile. And then after Christie wrote the novel, she adapted it while she was working on the theatrical adaptation of And Then There Were None. It went up first in Scotland in 1944 under the title Hidden Horizon, and then as Murder on the Nile in London 2 years later. And the play is notable for changing a lot of the names, merging a lot of different characters, and completely cutting out Poirot. So that's interesting. Then there was a 1-hour televised adaptation of the novel produced by Kraft Television Theater, which aired in the U.S. in 1950. We, unfortunately, will never get to see that, and I have no idea how you adapt this novel into an hour-long episode, but okay. And then the next adaptation is by far the most famous, and that's the 1978 version starring Peter Ustinov in his first of 6 appearances as Hercule Poirot, and Mia Farrow as a decidedly not Latin but nevertheless fiery Jacqueline, as well as a bevy of film legends in supporting roles. More on that in a moment. And it was produced by the same producer of Murder on the Orient Express, John Brayburn, and directed by John Guillermin. And like Murder on the Orient Express, this film also won an Academy Award, not for acting, since Ingrid Bergman was not in it, but for Best Costume, which for Bette Davis's hats alone was absolutely warranted.
You know, we can talk about Peter Ustinov, but I really think that if we are going to talk about that adaptation, it's going to be to talk about Bette Davis.
It's pretty much all about Bette Davis, but as I always want to do when we're discussing a film adaptation, I want to quickly quote Mark Aldridge, our good friend, from his book, Agatha Christie on Screen, because he sums up what Bette Davis, Maggie Smith, and Angela Lansbury are doing in this movie very well. This is what he says. These actresses increase the camp value of the film by quite a margin when compared with Murder on the Orient Express, in which director Sidney Lumet had expressly tried to avoid such a tone. Here, however, we are presented with a puzzle that is framed between what at times feels like the actor's best party tricks, Bette Davis as the mischievous old woman and Maggie Smith in masculine clothes evocative of lesbian style of the period, while talking disparagingly but amusingly of the body massage with which she provides her employer.
Come along now, back to the cabin. Time for your massage.
My companion Bowers. She did 15 rounds once with Jack Dempsey. He was never the same man again.
I saw you drooling over her pearls.
Shut up, Bowers.
You'd give every tooth in your head to lay your hands on them.
What nonsense, just because you've got a grudge against her, or rather her father. No need to be uncivil.
Grudge? Malouish Ridgway ruined my family.
Well, you should be grateful. If he hadn't, you'd have missed the pleasure of working for me.
Could kill her on that score alone.
These performances are almost demure by comparison with Lansbury's hilarious and full-bodied turn as the apparent comic relief.
Will you not join me for a little refreshment? This marvelous little man here has just made me the most extraordinary concoction out of native fruit juices. It's called a golden sebek and is named after the god of the ancient city of Crocodilopolis.
There's a lot happening there. And I'm not just talking about her turbans. Angela Lansbury plays drunk very convincingly. She's not a secret drunk like in the book, but thank God, because she's able to play it up with that much more hilarity, just being openly drunk. It was striking to me how different the characters that Bette Davis and Maggie Smith are playing in Miss Van Schuyler and Bowers, the nurse, are from the book, but it just doesn't matter because everything they're doing is delightful, and you just want more. Especially Bette Davis. Bette Davis is playing Bette Davis. I was struck by how much I liked the 1978 version again. There are some people, it seems, that like the 70s Murder on the Orient Express more than Death on the Nile. I definitely fall into the category of liking Death on the Nile much more than Murder on the Orient Express.
There's a clear answer to why, and it's because Albert Finney is terrible.
I still think that in his contrast, Albert Finney is doing something quite useful in that rather boring movie. But I don't disagree with you that I like Peter Ustinov's portrayal much more. I mean, Peter Ustinov is such a pleasant and charismatic presence that even though he's not playing Poirot, he's basically playing himself. Peter Ustinov was that guy who would just get on talk shows and talk everyone's ear off, much to their and the audience's delight. And he's basically doing that here. The one thing I did not like that the film does, though, is that they really do overtime on making sure every single character on that boat has a motive to kill Lynette Doyle. Like, she's suing Salome Otterborn for defamation, and she's saying nasty things about Dr. Bessner's clinic. It just gets a little ridiculous. There's no second gun, which is also significant because this Poirot certainly did not know
definitely is
that Jackie was going to commit suicide, which is in keeping with Ustinov's sunny portrayal of Poirot. The other criticism of that film, which many reviewers had, was its pacing, because it's 2 hours and 20 minutes long. There's a lot of unraveling of the mystery. We get lots of sequences of people who could have done it and how they would have done it. I enjoyed all of it because I enjoyed the performances, but I will say that moving on to the second adaptation, which is, of course, our beloved David Suchet, and this adaptation is notable for starring none other than Emily Blunt as Lynette Doyle, a very blonde, very American Emily Blunt. This is a much tighter adaptation of the story.
Yeah.
And this was done in season/series 9 in 2004. So this is certainly darker, more serious feature-length Poirot. And that feels appropriate here. And I already mentioned this, but this is where Suchet makes great use of those darker undertones to what Poirot might have missed out on in his life. Fun fact, apparently every single person in the cast was struck down at some point with a really bad stomach upset.
Oh, God.
In this version, he does know about the second gun. The movie ends with this pained look on his face that actually reminded me of, yes, Murder on the Orient Express, the Suchet version, where he also looked physically pained by what he had to do at the end.
Here's the question. It's in both that Murder on the Orient Express adaptation and this. Do we think what was written there is actually being portrayed in the Suchet portrayal?
I think for Death on the Nile, 100% yes. For Murder on the Orient Express, 100% no.
Right.
Which is interesting because that shows some inconsistency on Christie's part. So maybe Suchet, in that he at least made a decision and he wanted a juicier role because he was playing it for a quarter of a century. I kind of get why he ran with that and insisted on inserting it into stories such as Murder on the Orient Express. It makes sense.
Yeah, I follow that characterization because it seems accurate.
Yeah, no,
to me.
I came down pretty hard, I think, on Suchet's extra textual interpretation in the adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express on this podcast, but I'm revising that now with the greater context of what is actually within Christie's novels, because I think you do have to do a certain amount of picking and choosing because she's not entirely consistent, and it's a valid choice. I get it. I get why you would do that as an actor. I just have to mention, because it so rarely happens within this series, but when they find Louisa's corpse, she's stuffed in a cupboard instead of under the bed in the book. But when we see her body, you can totally see her breathing. It's a rare corpse breathing mistake. I always look for that in any murder mystery I watch. I'm like, are they moving? Are they moving? But then we also have to talk really briefly about the scene where Rosalie takes Tim Allerton's hand and we think that they're going to have a connection as they did in the novel.
Barking up the wrong tree, I'm afraid.
Which would seem to indicate he's gay. But then immediately after that, his mother calls him into his cabin somewhat lasciviously.
I know.
It's so bizarre.
That's super weird.
I don't really know what they were going for with that. The other thing that this adaptation is notable for is that it opens up on a sex scene. Simon and Jackie are naked and they are in the middle of intercourse. And that is super racy for Agatha Christie's Poirot. Okay, let's move on to rankings. You know, my problem with the plot mechanics and the plot credibility have nothing to do with believing that Jackie would have done what she did or that Simon would have done what he did. I 100% believe that. It's just that the whole point of this is that it was meticulously planned out. And Poirot even says, he has a line here where he says, "This crime wasn't safe. It hung on a razor edge." And that's absolutely true. There were so many ways in which this could have gone wrong and not worked out. And it just seems like if you're going to meticulously plan the murder of this woman because you want to get her money, you're not going to do it on a close quarters steamer where a bunch of people could see you do it and where that in fact happened so that they then subsequently had to kill 2 other people and ended up messing up the whole thing. It's not a good idea.
No, it's not a good idea at all. It makes them seem really stupid, and I don't think they're stupid. I don't think that there is any sort of justification in the story to make them look like they're stupid.
Right. Like, I believe the audacity of the crime because Jackie is audacious and Simon would just follow along. I believe all of that. I don't believe the stupidity that it takes to think that you can actually pull this off on a boat. The closed circle nature of this story, which is what makes it so fun. So I understand why Christie wrote the novel. I'm glad she wrote the novel, but it's a fundamental flaw. And I think it's what makes both the plot mechanics and the plot credibility not abysmal by any means, but just not one of the better Christies.
Pretty low, I would think.
Funnily enough, I think this is where we both came out pretty similar because I wanted to give them both 6s.
Oh, and I was exactly with you.
Wow, that's so funny. That's good that we agree on that. I think where we differ is as to characters. I've talked a lot about how much I like this novel as a Poirot novel. I love his conversation with Lynette, and I especially love all of his conversations with Jackie. I love the fact that we're getting Poirot en vacances in his white silk suit, carefully pressed, a Panama hat,
I know,
and highly ornamented fly whisk with a sham amber handle.
No, I loved that. Do not get me wrong.
I like all of the extra legal hijinks that Poirot engages in here.
It's a murder-suicide.
A murder-suicide. And there's actually even more that he does. And there's a comedic sequence in which Poirot lets off Tim Allerton for all of his jewel heisting, even though poor Inspector Japp is the one who's been investigating that case. He does not do Japp any favors in absentia because Tim Allerton is in love with Rosalie Otterborn and vice versa, and he wants them to end up together. And he also agrees to hush up Miss Van Schuyler's kleptomaniac ways. And Colonel Race actually says, this is hush-hush house. Anything short of murder is being hushed up. And that's very Poirot. That is the Poirot of these novels.
You know, I don't like it as a Poirot novel myself, but I see where you're coming from.
I put this at a 7. What did you put it as?
I think a 6.
I'm okay with the 6 because where I think we're going to have a lot of disagreement is on the book-specific characters. This is the quote, actually, that Christie said. I think the central situation is intriguing and has dramatic possibilities, and the 3 characters, Simon, Lynette, and Jacqueline, seem to me to be real and alive. That's what Christie said, as quoted by David Suchet, and I 100% agree. I think those 3 characters are actually some of Christie's best. I do have to call out, there's a total Christie in-joke going on here. When Salome Otterborn starts talking about her novels, her newest book is called Snow on the Desert's Face, and Agatha Christie's first and very much unpublished novel was called Snow Upon the Desert. She writes about it in her autobiography and makes it pretty clear that it was terrible, and she just seems to be poking fun at herself through this novelist character as she does. Salome Otterborn is
her name
a little
is
over the top.
Salome Otterborn.
I would argue that Salome Otterborn is obviously a nom de plume. I don't think Salome is her name. Her name is probably Eileen Otterborn. And of course she would name herself something ridiculous like that.
Anne Otterburn.
I'm not enamored of Salome Otterborn. I'm actually not even enamored of Miss Van Schuyler. I found her to be a little bit of a tired trope. And there was one moment when she's described as toad-like, which I think totally steps on the heels of Princess Dragomirov in Murder on the Orient Express. She already used that description. Right. The one thing I think we could say that Agatha Christie is not great at is physical descriptions because they just feel very much the same from book to book. We have more bronzed faces here in both Simon and, of course, Colonel Race. But here, another character I actually really liked was Rosalie Otterborn. I felt like her unhappiness and her pain at having to hide her mother's secret drinking was actually really effective. To me, it felt very real that she was vamping as this scornful, too cool for school young thing. And actually at the center of it was just this scared girl who was essentially a mess.
Had a crush on Tim Allerton.
And who had a crush on Tim Allerton, and they lived happily ever after. The romantic hijinks that she telegraphs between the two of them, hating each other at first and then falling in love, and all the business with Cornelia Robson and Dr. Bessner, that is all a bit juvenile, but I just have to highlight the final interaction between Cornelia Robson and Mr. Ferguson made me laugh aloud when he finds out that she's going to marry Dr. Bessner, and he says, "Do you mean to say," asked Mr. Ferguson incredulously, "that you'd rather marry that disgusting old man than me?" "Yes, I would. You're not reliable. You wouldn't be at all a comfortable sort of person to live with. And he's not old. He's not 50 yet. He's got a stomach," said Mr. Ferguson venomously. "Well, I've got round shoulders," retorted Cornelia. And it's just like so ridiculous, but you kind of need some of that comic relief in this book, especially when you have Jackie murder-suiciding all over the place.
I don't like this book that much. And there are other Christie books that I think are just heartbreaking. And I don't think this book is heartbreaking because I don't think it earns it at all. But I do think that it has an incredibly bleak ending.
So, I mean, here's where I come down on book-specific characters. I think especially given that this is Christie we're talking about, and this is in the context of some book that really have some clunkers, I think she's got a lot of great characters and excellent characterization in this book. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but I'm saying that there's a lot to hold on to in here. That's why I come out on a 7.
I'm happy to grant you that. That's fine.
Okay, and then the other area where I come out very high is actually on setting and tone. This is the first time that we've gotten a traveling book, we could argue, since The Man in the Brown Suit, since Murder in Mesopotamia is abroad, but they're not actually traveling, right? And Murder on the Orient Express is sort of a traveling book, but not really, because the train is stationary most of the time. We really get a sense here of English people traveling abroad. And I think similar to The Man in the Brown Suit, this book very much delivered on putting us in the mode of traveling, because it's very obvious that Christie actually took this very trip and traveled around a lot in the Middle East. And there's this moment when Poirot and Rosalie and Tim are studying the new arrivals, and Christie writes, all three wore the air of superiority assumed by people who are already in a place when studying new arrivals. And I know exactly what she means there. It's like they've been there for 2 days and they're like, oh, we're locals. We know where to get all the best beads. Right. And then there is so much local color thrown in here on this boat trip on the Nile. I will just point out a few of them. The agility with which the Nubian boatman steered the boat with his toes as he manipulated the sail with his hands. It was very peaceful on the water, the great smooth slippery black rocks gliding by and the soft breeze fanning their faces. And then Mrs. Allerton, who is often shockingly dismissive of the local people and their suffering. There's a lot of offensive things she says about them. She says, you can never be alone anywhere. Someone is always pestering you for money or offering you donkeys or beads or expeditions to native villages or duck shooting. There's a lot more. I won't go into it. Most of it has to do with water and rocks and the landscape as they're going down the Nile. But I felt that it was the right amount of reminding me where they were, that we were actually on the Nile. I could see it. Didn't feel like she forgot it, as it sometimes feels like she forgets her setting. And it felt evoked to me. You know, it's in the title, right? They're on the Nile. You've got to deliver on that. And I think she did. And I wasn't sure if she did. And that's why I waited to watch the movies until after I read the book, because sometimes the movie ends up doing some of that heavy lifting for her, I think. And I certainly think that was the case in Murder on the Orient Express. I don't think it was the case here. I actually really think that she did an excellent job with the setting. And tone-wise, other than that clunky opening, I think this is a stylistically solid book of hers. It's Poirot in the third person, but it's not awkward. It's confidently told.
I did not necessarily feel the same way about the depiction of Egypt and the Nile. I completely understand what you were arguing, and I feel like that's valid, but I didn't feel it when I was reading it. I think that she has done so much better elsewhere.
I would give it an 8.
I will compromise to a 7.
And then we can talk really briefly about Stuck in Its Time, because it's not that there isn't anything, because, you know, in a novel, there's usually something that we can point to and nitpick at. Here's the thing. For a novel set in the Middle East, written in the 30s by Agatha Christie, oh boy, I would think that there would be a lot in there to get upset about, right? There's not. The most upsetting things are actually put in the mouth of Mrs. Allerton. And as we've discussed many times before, that's where we have to give Christie the benefit of the doubt, because that seems to be partially the kind of person Mrs. Allerton is. She's a jolly colonialist, you know?
Yeah, getting beads from natives.
And then talking about how gross it is that they have flies in their nose. I'm like, lady, maybe you should help them out.
Yeah.
We can't ding Christie for that. So I would actually give it 0 deductions. Again, not because there isn't anything. I have a list, but it just wasn't anything important enough for me to highlight. I would do 0 deductions for that.
No, I mean, I felt that.
So that brings us to a grand total of 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 7 plus 7 minus 0 deductions for 32 points, which ties Death on the Nile with 3-act tragedy, and we are going to give the edge to Death on the Nile, which means that it is falling in 6th place overall. Just as a little reminder, we have The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Murder on the Orient Express, Peril at End House, The Murder at the Vicarage, Cards on the Table, now Death on the Nile, followed by 3-act tragedy, The ABC Murders, The Sidiford Mystery, and Lord Edward Dies. Those are our current top 10. This, by the way, is our 22nd novel, which means that we are officially 1/3 of the way through Christie's canon. That is Death on the Nile. That is a big novel to get under our belt. We will be doing a short story next time. A Tommy and Tuppence, actually. We are returning to our dear Tommy and Tuppence for a little walk on the lighter side.
Well, you know what? Until we get to them in NRM, which is very soon, actually.
It's coming up, and this actually is a full circle with the fact that we're hurtling into World War II. NRM is certainly one of Christie's World War II novels. We have to finish up the Partners in Crime short story collection before we get to NRM, just for purposes of continuity. So we've got, I think, about a half dozen more of those, and the Sunningdale Mystery is the first of them. And we should mention that our next novel is, of course, a Poirot novel, but our second to last of the 30s Poirot novels, and that is Appointment with Death. In the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. We're on Facebook. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and we're also on Instagram at All About Agatha. Please do take a moment to rate and review us. We appreciate it. It helps out our podcast. It helps other listeners find the podcast, the ever-growing Christie community, and we look forward to talking to you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to NYX? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from NYX. That's KNIX. Period panties from NYX are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try NYX. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to NYX. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.